Hello, welcome to this episode of Rich Insights. I'm Don Rich, Head of Investments for Esoterica Capital Markets. Today's topic is on U.S.-China relations. Right? This is the second episode in a multi-segment series on the U.S.-China dispute. Right? If you missed the first one, which was yesterday, you can find it online or follow me on LinkedIn. The title of yesterday's video was called Foot on the Throat Diplomacy. Foot on the Throat Diplomacy. Okay, so let's start today here at 30,000 feet and outline the big picture. All right. The escalating political tensions between the U.S. and China increased substantially last week. Right. U.S.-China relations are now considered by most to be a trade war. Right. Some have even gone as far as calling it a Cold War, right? A Cold War. Perhaps the foremost expert in this area is Stephen Roach, and he recently described it as a Cold War. In fact, he said tensions today are as high as they've been in the last 25 years. So while most people consider it at the very least to be a trade war, some are describing this as a Cold War. What this really is, I think, is a race to technology supremacy. Technology supremacy. I think that's what we're talking about. And computer chips, all right? Computer chips, more specifically semiconductors, are the latest weapon in this trade dispute. So the technology and IP race is on. Focus is on 5G, artificial intelligence, machine learning, autonomous vehicles, mixed reality, and so forth, right? So what's different this time? Well, 10 or 12 years ago, when 4G was introduced, it wasn't universally adopted. Right? The United States and South Korea were early adopters, and that proved to give them a huge advantage in the race, in the digital economy race. But fool me once, right? Now everyone knows, all countries understand the importance of technology, and the tech race is about long-term strategic interests and establishing multi-collateral connections. So I have with me in the studio today a colleague of mine. Welcome, Young. Let's start here at 30,000 feet. Again, what is your take? Is it an understatement or an overstatement of the situation as I described it today?
Hi, Don. Thanks for having me here. I think you summarized it pretty well, and I think we are definitely on the path to, if not we're not already there, we're definitely on the path to a technology Cold War, and it's definitely escalating given what's happening over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah. So very quickly, let's talk about those recent events. Sometime in the last, it's called about a week and a half ago, Taiwan Semiconductor announced that they were building a plant in Arizona, right? That was no big deal, not a big story, right? People essentially shrugged it off. But the next day, the China-based Huawei was put on a restricted list. Essentially restricting them from accessing chips made with U.S. software or technology. All right. And now, if you put those two together, you get a much bigger and more interesting story evolving here. So let's start at the beginning here, Young. Tell us a little bit about Taiwan Semiconductors. Right? I know they're the largest company in Taiwan. I assume that they're critical in the semiconductor space. Tell us more about them.
So Taiwan Semiconductor, TSMC, it is the biggest company in Taiwan, and most people know it's critical in semiconductor, but I don't think many people realize just how important they are. It is the largest foundry in the world. Basically, companies like Apple, Qualcomm, and NVIDIA, the US semi giants that we know today, they design their own processors, but they rely on TSMC to actually manufacture it.
So
Apple...
These U.S. companies are not developing their own chips. They develop the technology and then they outsource the manufacturing?
Yeah, they design the processor, but TSMC is the one that actually does the manufacturing.
Okay. And how big a percentage of the marketplace did you say they account for?
So the U.S., I think they contribute about 60% of the revenue for TSM, and China is about 20%.
Is there anyone even close to them in size or stature, or throwing out the numbers that you just did? It sounds like they are essentially the chip maker to the world.
They pretty much TSMC it pretty much is. So if you look at the market, the overall global market for the foundry, TSM has about 50% market share, and that's the total foundry market. If you just look at the most leading edge, the most advanced ones, the ones that use 7 nanometer or 5 nanometer to manufacture processors, TSM is pretty much the dominant one. It's essentially a monopoly right now.
The events of the last week, they're building a factory in Arizona. Who the hell cares? I mean, why is this a story? Why is this significant?
It is significant by itself. If we just put the U.S.-China relationship aside, just look at the business side of it. So TSM, they have 50% market share, as we talked about, and the smaller competitors there are Samsung, Global Foundry in the U.S., Samsung in South Korea, and Intel. But they all have their own issues. For example, for Intel is pretty advanced in the semiconductor manufacturing. It's probably like a year behind TSM, but still pretty advanced.
Okay.
But the issue for Intel is that they mostly just manufacture whatever is designed itself. So they design processors for your PC, for server, and they just manufacture itself. For other designers, if you want to use Intel, that brings a huge issues, the conflict of interest. If I'm AMD, I'm designing a processor that's directly competing with Intel. There's no way I'm not going to make those chips at Intel's fab, right? Okay. Samsung has a similar issue. So Samsung, they designed their own mobile processor. And it's also like a generation, roughly like a year or so behind TSM in terms of technology. Those two are the closest competitor TSM has right now. And another competitor is Global Foundries. It's based in the US, but it has been competitive since, I don't know, for before 2016, 2017. At least they were trying to be competitive. But a couple of years ago, they decided we just can't keep up with TSM, so we give up. And we're gonna just stay on the more mature technology and stop investing in the most advanced ones. So there you have Global Foundries basically exiting the most advanced market.
Okay,
and
so
you have the competitors.
Okay.
Another one is.
Go ahead.
Another one is called Semiconductor Manufacturer International Company based in China. That's a SMIC. So they're still trying to catch up, but they're 2 generations behind, but they are catching up right now.
Okay, so Taiwan Semiconductor, I guess for the first time, is they're building a plant, building a factory, a facility in the U.S. I believe it was in Arizona. And they're the only ones, or why is this an important event?
So think about one trend we see over the past couple of years is processors are no longer just designed by the semiconductor companies like Intel and Qualcomm. If you talk to Google, Amazon, Apple, they're all designing their own processors, and these processors are all built in TSMC out of Taiwan. So think about if anything happens, either a pandemic or military conflict or something like that, the supply chain has some disruption. It's going to be a huge issue for not only the semiconductor supply chain, but the whole hardware and technology supply chain. Because these chips you use it in your smartphone, and Google and Amazon, they use it in the cloud data center, and that's basically the infrastructure of the entire digital economy. So that's why it's so important for the U.S. government to push to have some leading edge fab in the U.S. soil.
So this deglobalization, right? The realignment of supply chains to to avoid the geographic concentration is all at issue here, right? This is really, you're describing it as the first step is in the deglobalization process, it sounds like.
Yeah, I would think so. The fab that TSMC announced right now is not huge. If you look at the capacity, it's about 1/5 of the size they have, the current 5-nanometer fab they have in Taiwan. But if this geopolitical conflict keeps rising up, I wouldn't be too surprised to see TSM maybe expand their footprint in the U.S.
And why now? Why now? Is it just because of the sort of deglobalization push that's going on right now? Is it coronavirus related? Are they? Is this again part of the foot on the throat diplomacy? Are they being forced to by government officials? Why do you think it's happening now?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important reasons is that U.S. is trying really hard right now to have a local fab, and they're going to do it with or without TSMC's help. Without TSMC, I can think of 3 possible ways they can do it. First, to have Samsung to build a similar fab in the U.S. And the second is having Intel spin off their foundry operation and create a pure commercial foundry without the conflict of interest we talked about.
Right.
I mean, they are probably a year behind in terms of technology, but it's better than nothing. And the third operation is to organize the current TSMC's customer, like Apple, Qualcomm, and Google, and have them to invest a brand new fab, a foundry operation in the U.S. As we talked about earlier, it's pretty critical to have, in terms of the supply chain resiliency and security, to have such fab in the U.S.
Right.
So if they do it, I don't know if any of the 3 options I mentioned earlier will be successful. But if any of it does, it'll be a huge blow to TSMC's current U.S. operation. So the U.S. customers, they're going to think again if they will still want to do the business with TSM or do it with some of the local foundries. That's why I think TSMC is doing it right now.
Yeah, so we're not talking about a lot of jobs. We're not talking about a huge investment here. I think it was $10 or $12 billion for this factory built, right? We're not talking about huge numbers. So again, the significance of this, I guess it sounds like the way you're describing it, it's partly driven by Taiwan Semiconductor company itself, but perhaps even as much or more driven by pressure from the U.S. to set up the facility, to have this self-sustaining ecosystem, self-sustaining supply system within the U.S. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's more driven by the U.S. pressure. And the way I see it, TSM is still trying to, in some way, stay out of the politics and at least appear to be more neutral in this tech cold war. The $12 billion over the next decade investment, it's not huge by itself.
Right.
Right. It's only going to create like 1,600 jobs or something.
1,600.
Yeah.
1,600.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's 1,600 direct job. So it's not a huge operation.
Right.
And compared to the current capacity, it's just not that big. So I think they started with a small step in the U.S. and that's their way to not irritate the China too much and still appear to stay neutral.
Okay, so that was day one, right? Day one was Taiwan Semiconductor announced that they were building a plant in the U.S. and now, as you describe it, this had more to do with politics, with being self-sustaining in the technology area. Then on day two, right, the next day, there was another Huawei announcement, right? And we've heard about Huawei now for the last, I don't know, year and a half or so, right? The whole event started back in like December of 18, where the CFO of Huawei was arrested, and there's been an ongoing saga since then, right? The original arrest, I believe, it was in Vancouver, Canada, but it was really, Canada was just a puppet, I think, between the U.S. and China on these issues. So let's start. Tell us about Huawei. When I think of Huawei, I think of like AT&T as their counterpart. Is that fair, or tell me about Huawei?
Huawei, I think if you think about their business, you can broadly think about two parts. First is the telecom equipment business. They are the largest telecom equipment providers in the world. They compete with Nokia, Ericsson, and the ZTE in the world. And the other part is the smartphone business, the consumer business, including smartphone and PC and all kinds of consumer electronic devices. And they are now the second largest smartphone providers in the world. So, they're a pretty dominant player if you just look at the wireless industry in general.
Yeah, so it's not fair just to think of them as Verizon, AT&T. They do compete, I guess, in that space. But you're saying, as well in smartphones and other areas. So that is there a competitor that the U.S. audience may be more familiar with?
Think about Ericsson and Nokia. So, guys who mentioned AT&T and Verizon, they build their wireless network, but they have to buy the equipment, the baseband, the radio head, buy this stuff from Verizon and from Ericsson and Nokia, and that's where Huawei competes.
Okay. So Huawei is placed on this restricted list. It's not the first time they've been identified, or some call it being blacklisted. What's the significance of this new restricted list that they've been placed on? Why is it important?
Huawei was first put on the so-called entity list. I think it was May of 2019, May last year. So last year they already had limited access to the U.S. semiconductor components over the past 12 months. So that was more about limiting Huawei's ability to buy certain components from U.S. companies. So the latest restriction is one step further. It targets high silicon more precisely. So high silicon is Huawei's semiconductor units. It designed the processors itself, and again, they outsource the manufacture to TSMC. So right now, with the new restriction, if TSMC want to ship any of the Huawei designed processor to Huawei, they just can't without a license from the U.S. government. In fact, it's not just TSMC. Any foundries in the world, Samsung, the SMIC, the ones we just talked about, they can't do any business with Huawei and high silicon without a license from the U.S. government.
Wow, this is interesting stuff. So to try to pull the pieces together, then we have Taiwan Semiconductor building this factory in the U.S., and that's for strategic reasons, for self-sufficiency, for supply chain diversification, and at the same time, they're also putting restrictions on Huawei, which should slow down China and Chinese companies in this tech race, I guess. It's a multi-frontal assault, I think, is what we're looking at. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So what the U.S. is doing right now is basically leveraging their strong position in the semiconductor equipment market to prevent Huawei. And for now, it's just Huawei. We don't know if there's going to be more, but just for now, to prevent Huawei from accessing the most leading edge manufacturing capability.
Oh, this is good stuff. This is great color, Young. I really, really appreciate this. What seemed to be like two relatively unimportant stories, when you put them together and you start, explaining things in the broader context as you laid out for us here, these are not trivial events, right? These are important events that are evolving before our very eyes today. So, Yang, again, thank you for being on the show today. I hope that everyone's learned a little bit more about these issues and just how important they are. And obviously, these are going to have investment implications here as we go forward. So we'll keep track of this. And like I said, this is the second in a multi-segment series on this topic here. So that's our message for today. I'm Don Rich. You just experienced a rich insight. I hope you've enjoyed this. May your beer be colder than the company you keep.